Inside Egypt's Temple of Esna, a hidden world of unusual hieroglyphic patterns has challenged experts trying to understand their true purpose. These 3,000-year-old cryptographic symbols remain among the temple's most haunting, unanswered secrets. Yet this mystery is only one among many scattered across the ancient world. For centuries, civilizations have left behind traces of knowledge, warnings, beliefs, and messages that continue to resist explanation. This collection explores 22 extraordinary mysteries where archaeology, history, and unanswered questions collide. From forgotten inscriptions to impossible discoveries, each case reveals how much of the past still lies beyond our reach. Now, the search begins. The ceiling of the Esna Temple in Upper Egypt is blackened in places by centuries of soot, the legacy of villagers who once used the half-buried structure as a shelter for animals and a place to build fires. Look past the smoke stains, though, and the columns rise into a dense field of carved inscriptions. Hundreds of hieroglyphic signs packed together with an intricacy that, even by Egyptian standards, feels almost obsessive. This is a temple dedicated to the ram-headed god Khnum, largely built during the Roman period, roughly the 1st centuries AD, and buried within its inscriptions is a script that, in places, no longer behaves like Egyptian writing at all. Hieroglyphic Egyptian, by the time of Esna's construction, had been in continuous use for over 3,000 years. Scholars have read royal decrees, religious hymns, medical texts, and private letters written in its various forms. The language, in other words, is not the mystery. What is unusual about Esna is how its priests chose to write it. Beginning in the late 1990s and continuing through more recent surveys, Egyptologists studying the temple's ceiling inscriptions noticed something strange. Dozens of hieroglyphic signs that do not appear anywhere else in the entire corpus of ancient Egyptian writing. Not rare variants, not regional spelling quirks. Entirely unique signs, seemingly invented specifically for use at Esna, and in many cases used only once, in a single inscription, before vanishing from the record entirely. Some of these signs are elaborations of animals, crocodiles, snakes, or the ram associated with Khnum himself, rendered with additional details or unusual postures that appear to carry symbolic weight beyond simple decoration. Researchers have proposed that the priests at Esna were deliberately expanding their own religious vocabulary, layering additional meaning onto standard signs in order to encode multiple readings within a single inscription. A kind of theological wordplay, dense with allusion, intended to be unpacked slowly by initiated readers rather than read straightforwardly at a glance. That explanation accounts for much of what appears on the ceiling, but it does not fully explain the sheer scale of invention involved. Why would a single temple, in a relatively modest provincial town, produce this volume of unprecedented symbols when far larger and more prominent temples elsewhere in Egypt show no comparable pattern? Was Esna home to a particularly ambitious school of priestly scribes, operating with unusual creative latitude? Or does the density of invented signs reflect something closer to a private theological language, deliberately restricted to a small circle capable of reading it? Some Egyptologists studying the material have described it as a kind of cryptographic writing, not a code meant to conceal information from enemies, in the way modern cryptography implies, but a deliberately layered script meant to slow down and deepen the act of reading itself, forcing initiated priests to linger over each sign's possible meanings rather than moving quickly through a text. Under this view, difficulty was the point. The temple's ceiling was not meant to be read easily by anyone. At the more speculative edges of the discussion, a few independent researchers have suggested that Esna's unusual density of invented signs may preserve fragments of older, unrecorded religious traditions specific to this region, remnants of local theology that never made it into the broader, more standardized temple literature preserved elsewhere. Mainstream Egyptology remains cautious about this idea, given how little comparative material survives to test it against. What is certain is this: 3,000 years after hieroglyphic writing began, and roughly 2,000 years after this particular sealing was carved, a portion of it remains functionally untranslated. Not because the language is unknown, but because these particular signs were never meant to be common knowledge in the first place. The soot may eventually be cleaned away. The signs above it are still waiting to be fully read. Long before Esna's priests ever carved their private vocabulary into a temple ceiling, the tradition of encoding sacred meaning beyond plain language had already taken root, nearly 2,500 years earlier, in the narrow, star-painted chambers beneath the pyramids of Saqqara. Here, inside the pyramid of King Unas, last ruler of Egypt's 5th dynasty, lie the oldest religious texts in the world. What Egyptologists now call the pyramid texts, carved into the interior walls sometime around 2350 BC. These vertical columns of hieroglyphs, densely packed and originally filled with blue-green pigment, represent humanity's earliest surviving body of religious literature. Spells, hymns, and ritual utterances meant to guide the king's spirit through the transition from death into the afterlife. Since their rediscovery in the late 19th century, Egyptologists have translated the vast majority of these texts with considerable confidence. The core content is not, by any means, a mystery, but scattered through the margins of these inscriptions, in the narrow spaces between columns, along the borders of certain spells, and occasionally squeezed into gaps left by the original carvers, are smaller markings that have received far less attention and far less resolution. Small strokes, isolated symbols, sometimes just a single sign, disconnected from the grammatical structure of the surrounding text. Numerical-looking notations that don't correspond to any known counting system used elsewhere in Old Kingdom Egypt. To the untrained eye, they might look like scribal doodles, afterthoughts, or errors. To the researchers who have studied them closely, they raise a quieter, more persistent question. What were they actually for? The mainstream explanation, and a reasonable one, treats these marginal marks as a form of internal production notation. Instructions used by the teams of scribes and carvers responsible for laying out and executing the enormous inscriptional program inside the pyramid. Some Egyptologists have proposed that certain marks indicated which spell sequence came next, or marked sections for a specific carving team, functioning essentially as a construction checklist embedded permanently into a sacred text. Under this view, the markings are mundane in origin, however sacred the text surrounding them, a practical necessity of coordinating a massive, technically demanding project carried out by many hands over an extended period. This explanation accounts for a portion of what appears in the margins. It does not comfortably account for all of it. Some of the notations recur in patterns that don't obviously correlate with spell divisions or construction sequencing at all. Others appear in isolated instances, seemingly one-off marks with no repetition elsewhere in the same chamber, let alone in the corpus of pyramid texts found in later pyramids at Saqqara, where similar, though not identical, collections of spells were carved for subsequent kings. If these were purely functional production marks, why does their usage vary so inconsistently from one pyramid to the next, rather than settling into a standardized system that later builders simply reused? There is also the matter of placement. Several of the more puzzling marginal symbols appear specifically alongside spells related to the king's transformation into a star, or his ascent into the sky, some of the most cosmologically significant passages in the entire text. Is it coincidence that the least understood markings cluster near some of the most symbolically loaded content? Or does that placement suggest the marks carried a ritual function of their own, Perhaps notations meant to guide priests conducting associated offering rituals at specific points in the burial chamber, gestures and recitations that left no other trace in the historical record beyond this handful of enigmatic symbols. Some scholars specializing in Old Kingdom religious practice have suggested the marks may represent a kind of ephemeral ritual shorthand, a system understood by a small circle of officiating priests, never intended for wider legibility, and therefore never standardized in a way that later generations, or later Egyptologists, could easily reconstruct. If true, this would place the pyramid text margins in curious company with the invented signs later carved at Esna, both cases involving priestly writing systems seemingly designed for a narrow, initiated readership, rather than for broad transmission across Egyptian religious tradition. At the more speculative fringes of Old Kingdom scholarship, a smaller number of independent researchers have proposed that certain marginal notations may encode astronomical observations. Informal records tracking celestial events relevant to the pyramid's orientation or ritual timing, inserted by scribes alongside the formal religious text. Mainstream Egyptology remains skeptical of this reading, citing the lack of corroborating astronomical data elsewhere in the same chambers, though the theory persists in part because so little else has managed to fully explain the pattern. What remains undisputed is this: the core of the pyramid texts has been read, studied, and understood for well over a century. Yet, in the margins of those same walls, in the narrow spaces the scribes left behind almost as an afterthought, a smaller and stranger layer of writing continues to resist confident translation, not obscured by damage or the passage of time, but seemingly written from the very beginning, for eyes other than ours. Perhaps those marks were never meant to outlast the ritual they accompanied. Or perhaps they were meant to last exactly as long as they have. Quietly present, fully visible, and still, after 4,000 years, waiting for someone to finally understand what they were instructed to do. If the priests who carved Esna's ceiling and the scribes who marked the margins at Saqqara were writing for a select few, one figure stands even further back in Egyptian history, at the very threshold where writing itself was just beginning to take shape, a ruler known to us only by a symbol, whose own name may be the oldest unsolved sign in the entire hieroglyphic tradition. He is known today as the Scorpion King, though that title is itself a modern convenience rather than a name he would have recognized. The identification comes from a single carved image, a scorpion, rendered beside a figure wearing the white crown associated with Upper Egyptian kingship, found on a limestone mace head excavated at Hierakonpolis in the late 19th century, and now held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The mace head dates to roughly 3100 BC, placing it at the very edge of the pre-dynastic period, just before Egypt's traditional unification under the first pharaohs of Dynasty I. The scorpion sign itself is not the mystery. Scorpions appear elsewhere in early Egyptian iconography, and the symbol's general association with authority, danger, and protective power is reasonably well understood by scholars of the period. The mystery lies in what, precisely, that symbol was meant to represent when paired with a royal figure at this specific, transitional moment in Egyptian history, a period so early that the conventions of writing itself had not yet stabilized into anything resembling the mature hieroglyphic system found in later royal inscriptions. Later, Egyptian kings are identified by clear, standardized conventions. A serac, a rectangular frame representing a palace facade, topped by a falcon and containing the king's Horus name written in fully developed hieroglyphic script. The scorpion mace head predates this convention's full standardization. Is the scorpion symbol beside this figure functioning as a name, in the way later Horus names operated? Or is it functioning more like a title, an epithet, or even a religious designation entirely separate from personal identity as later Egyptians would have understood it? Egyptologists remain genuinely divided, and the honest answer is that the writing system in use at this moment may not map cleanly onto any of our modern categories at all. Complicating the picture further is a puzzle within the puzzle. Archaeologists and epigraphers have identified evidence suggesting more than one pre-dynastic ruler may have used scorpion-related imagery, separated potentially by a significant span of time. A separate, smaller ivory artifact bearing scorpion imagery has also been associated with this period, raising the possibility that Scorpion King may not refer to a single individual at all, but to two or more rulers, generations apart, who each adopted the same powerful symbol independently. If that's the case, how many different Scorpion Kings once ruled some portion of Upper Egypt, and how would we ever fully distinguish their individual reigns using symbols this sparse, this early, and this inconsistently preserved? The scorpion mace head itself deepens the puzzle beyond the name. Carved into its surface is a scene long interpreted as depicting the king performing an irrigation ceremony, wielding a hoe beside a canal, attended by figures carrying regional standards. Some Egyptologists read this as an early, symbolic assertion of centralized authority over agricultural infrastructure, a political statement carved in stone at the birth of Egyptian kingship. Others have questioned this reading entirely, noting that portions of the scene are damaged and that the ceremonial activity depicted may represent something closer to ritual or religious symbolism than literal irrigation policy. Even the central narrative of one of the most famous objects from this period, in other words, remains genuinely contested among specialists. Not a settled fact quietly awaiting popular discovery, but an active point of scholarly disagreement. Why does this matter for the sign itself? Because if we cannot fully agree on what the scene beside the king depicts, our confidence in reading the scorpion symbol accompanying it grows correspondingly uncertain. Names, titles, and religious designations were not always neatly separated in this formative period of Egyptian symbolic writing. The scorpion may have functioned as all three simultaneously, layered with a flexibility that later, more rigid hieroglyphic conventions would eventually eliminate. At the outer edges of scholarly speculation, a few researchers have proposed that the scorpion symbol may connect to older, pre-literate religious traditions from the pre-dynastic period that never survived into later dynastic religion in any directly traceable form, meaning the sign might encode a belief system or a source of royal legitimacy that vanished from Egyptian memory not long after this king's reign ended. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as an intriguing possibility rather than an established conclusion, given how little comparable material survives from this transitional era to test it against. What remains certain is this: more than 5,000 years after it was carved, the sign beside the Scorpion King still resists a fully agreed reading, not because the object is inaccessible or the scholarship insufficient, but because it was created at the exact moment when Egyptian writing itself was still deciding what a symbol beside a king's image was supposed to mean. Perhaps the answer was never meant to require translation in the way we now expect from later fully developed hieroglyphs. Or perhaps it once carried a precision entirely lost to us, legible only to the very few who stood beside that mace head when it was new. Either way, the scorpion remains exactly where it was carved, and the question of who or what it truly named is still, after 5 millennia, wide open. North from Hierakonpolis, along the same Nile that carried the Scorpion King's authority downstream, lies Abydos, the necropolis where Egypt's earliest kings were buried, and where, in the desert sand of Cemetery U, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a ruler whose name may be the very oldest fragment of writing Egypt has ever produced. He is known to us as Iry-Hor, a name reconstructed by Egyptologists from a small cluster of inscribed pottery jars and clay ceilings discovered primarily in Tomb UJ and surrounding tombs at Abydos, excavated by the German Archaeological Institute beginning in the 1980s and 1990s. Iry-Hor is generally placed even earlier than the Scorpion King, positioned by most Egyptologists at the very end of the pre-dynastic period, shortly before Egypt's unification under Narmer, making him, by some estimates, among the very first named rulers in Egyptian history, and possibly the earliest king whose name survives in any written form at all. The inscriptions associated with Iry-Hor consist of a simple, recurring combination. A mouth sign, read phonetically as Ire, positioned above or beside a falcon representing the god Horus, together yielding the reading Iry-Hor, often translated loosely as belonging to Horus or companion of Horus. On the surface, this seems a straightforward royal name, consistent with the pattern later Egyptian kings would follow for millennia, associating themselves directly with Horus through their formal titulary. But the deeper you look at how this name was actually recorded, the less settled the picture becomes. Unlike later royal names, which appear consistently within a serek, that rectangular palace facade frame topped by a falcon, which by the first dynasty had become the standard convention for writing a king's name, the markings associated with Iry-Hor appear in a more variable, less standardized form. Some examples show the signs without a serek at all, simply incised directly onto pottery. Others show partial or ambiguous framing that some Egyptologists interpret as an early, unstabilized version of the serek convention, and others rate as something else entirely. Perhaps not a royal name frame in the later sense at all, but a different kind of marking whose original function we no longer fully understand. This raises a genuinely difficult question for specialists in early Egyptian writing. At what point does a repeated combination of signs actually become a name, in the sense we mean when we talk about royal titulary? Iry-Hor's inscriptions are early enough that they sit right at that threshold, plausibly a king's name, written before the conventions for writing a king's name had fully solidified. If that's the case, Iry-Hor may represent one of the very first moments in human history where a ruler's identity was committed to a durable, written symbol, rather than surviving only through oral memory. That alone would make the inscription extraordinary, regardless of how confidently we can translate every detail of its execution. But the uncertainty runs deeper still. A number of Egyptologists have pointed out that the mouth sign plus falcon combination is unusually sparse compared to later royal names, which tend to include more elaborate epithets, symbols of divine favor, or additional identifying elements. Is the brevity of Iry-Hor's inscription a reflection of his genuine historical importance, a minor transitional ruler whose name required no further embellishment? Or does the sparseness instead reflect the limitations of a writing system still finding its footing, unable yet to encode the fuller ceremonial complexity that later Egyptian kings would demand of their own names? There is also the question of whether Iry-Hor was ever intended to function as this ruler's actual personal name at all, as opposed to a title or epithet describing his relationship to the god Horus more generally. A distinction that later, fully developed Egyptian titulary keeps quite clear, but which this much earlier material may not have distinguished in the same way. Some specialists in early dynastic Egypt have suggested that the entire category of royal name may be an anachronistic framework we are projecting backward onto a period when kingship, writing, and religious authority were still being defined in relation to one another, rather than existing as separate, stable categories at all. At the furthest edges of speculation, A handful of independent researchers have proposed that Iry-Hor's inscriptions may represent not a personal name in any modern sense, but a dynastic or clan designation shared across multiple early rulers at Abydos, meaning the man we call Iry-Hor today might actually be several individuals, unified under scholarly convenience rather than historical fact. Mainstream Egyptology remains cautious of this reading, given the limited material available, though the theory persists precisely because so little else fully resolves the inconsistencies in how these signs appear across different tombs. What remains certain is only this. Somewhere in the desert sand at Abydos, on fragments of pottery over 5,000 years old, sits what may be the very first written expression of a human being's claim to kingship, recorded in a script still teaching itself how to speak. Whether we are reading a name, a title, or something with no true equivalent in later Egyptian tradition remains genuinely unresolved. And one has to wonder, at the very birth of writing itself, how much of what these earliest kings meant to say may simply have no modern translation at all. That question, whether a name, a title, or something with no modern equivalent at all, turns out to apply to more than just kings. It applies just as forcefully to the symbols standing beside them, the standards, emblems, and totems carried before these early rulers, whose meaning may be even harder to pin down than the names of the men they accompanied. Among the earliest and most persistent of these is a specific emblem that appears repeatedly on artifacts from Egypt's late pre-dynastic period. The era archaeologists now informally call Dynasty 0, spanning roughly the centuries just before 3100 BC, when regional chiefdoms along the Nile were consolidating into the unified kingdom that would follow. This emblem takes the form of a standard, a pole topped by a stylized symbol, carried in procession on ceremonial objects, pallets, and macehead fragments recovered from sites including Abydos and Hieroglyph. Unlike the falcon standard associated with Horus, which becomes clearly and consistently tied to royal authority in later Egyptian tradition, this particular emblem resists confident identification. Scholars are not entirely certain what it depicts, and less certain still what it meant. On some objects, the symbol atop the standard has been read as a stylized animal skin, possibly belonging to a canine or jackal-like creature, mounted in a manner reminiscent of later divine standards carried in dynastic religious processions. On other artifacts, the same general emblem appears rendered differently enough that some Egyptologists have questioned whether we are looking at one consistent symbol at all, or several distinct regional standards that modern scholarship has grouped together somewhat artificially, for lack of a clearer framework to separate them. This is where the mystery deepens. In later, well-documented Egyptian religion, divine standards are tied unambiguously to specific gods, specific nomes, or specific regional cults, their meaning reinforced by thousands of years of accompanying text. Dynasty 0 predates that textual scaffolding almost entirely. We are looking, in other words, at religious or political symbols from a period that left us the images without the explanation. Emblems carried in procession, evidently significant enough to warrant careful, repeated depiction, whose accompanying meaning simply was not recorded in any form that survived. Some archaeologists have proposed that this particular standard represents an early precursor to the historical Wepwawet standard, a jackal-associated emblem well attested in later Egyptian religion as a symbol of a war god and a guide for the dead. Under this reading, the Dynasty 0 emblem would represent one of the oldest visual antecedents of a cult that persisted, in recognizable form, for the next 3,000 years of Egyptian religious history, an extraordinary continuity if the identification holds. Other specialists remain more cautious, noting that the visual similarities, while suggestive, are not conclusive enough to confirm a direct, unbroken line between the pre-dynastic symbol and its later textually secure counterpart. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because if the emblem does connect directly to Wepwawet, it would push the origins of one of Egypt's oldest religious cults back into an era we can barely document through any other means, offering rare insight into the belief systems of a period otherwise almost silent to us. If it does not, then we are left with an entirely separate, now vanished cult or regional authority, whose symbol survived on stone and ivory while every trace of its actual meaning disappeared, along with the spoken and ritual tradition that once explained it. There is also the question of who carried this standard, and why. On several Dynasty 0 objects, the emblem appears grouped alongside other regional standards, in scenes some archaeologists interpret as processions representing an alliance, or perhaps a hierarchy, of early chiefdoms along the Nile, in the final stretch before unification. If that reading holds, this emblem may have represented not merely a religious cult, but an entire political entity, a proto-kingdom whose name, territory, and eventual fate were entirely absorbed into the unified Egyptian state that followed, leaving this single visual symbol as its only remaining trace in the historical record. At the more speculative edges of pre-dynastic scholarship, a small number of researchers have suggested that emblems like this one may encode information about specific alliances or conflicts between early Nile Valley polities that never survived in any other form. Meaning the true political history of Dynasty 0, the actual sequence of rivalries and consolidations that produced the unified Egyptian state, may be partially hidden in symbols like this standard, still awaiting a framework capable of reading them properly. Mainstream Egyptology treats this possibility as intriguing, but currently unprovable, given how sparse and how visually inconsistent the surviving examples remain. What can be said with confidence is only this: somewhere in the final, formative decades before Egypt became Egypt, a standard was carried before someone, or something, important enough to warrant careful, repeated depiction on objects meant to endure. Its bearer's identity, its precise religious meaning, and its ultimate connection to the gods and cults of later Egyptian history remain unresolved, and one is left to ask, how many of Egypt's oldest, most enduring religious traditions may have begun as symbols like this one, carried in procession, faithfully carved, and yet almost entirely unexplained. That standard, carried in procession, faithfully carved, yet still unexplained, was not an isolated case. Its shape, in fact, belongs to a much broader category of Egyptian writing that scholars have never fully resolved. The hieroglyphic sign known simply as the God Standard, a pole-mounted emblem so fundamental to Egyptian religious writing that it appears constantly throughout the language's entire 3,000-year history, and yet, in its earliest and most generic form, still carries a meaning modern scholars cannot fully pin down. In the standard hieroglyphic sign list compiled by Sir Alan Gardner in the 20th century, still used by Egyptologists today to classify and catalog hieroglyphic signs by category, the God Standard occupies its own dedicated section. Signs depicting a simple pole, sometimes bare, sometimes topped with a specific divine emblem, functioning grammatically as what linguists call a determinative, a silent sign placed at the end of a word to indicate its general category of meaning, in this case signaling that the word relates to a god, a temple, or something sacred. This much is well understood, and any student of Middle Egyptian learns to recognize it early in their training. But the sign's origin and its most basic undecorated form tell a murkier story. Before it became a grammatical marker embedded silently within religious vocabulary, the bare standard appears to have functioned as an actual physical object, a real pole, carried upright, planted before temples, tombs, and shrines throughout the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, sometimes shown in artwork bearing a specific emblem denoting a specific god, and sometimes, curiously, shown entirely bare, carrying no emblem at all. What did an empty standard signify? Was it simply an artistic shorthand, a generic marker meaning sacred place without specifying which deity presided there? Or did the bare pole itself, prior to any emblem being added, carry an independent significance now lost to us, a marker of sanctity that predates the specific gods later associated with it? Some Egyptologists argue that the bare standard represents the earliest stage of a symbol that later became specialized, gradually accumulating specific divine emblems as Egyptian religion itself grew more elaborate and its pantheon more clearly differentiated. Under this reading, the standard's evolution mirrors the evolution of Egyptian religion generally, a movement from broad, undifferentiated sacredness toward an increasingly organized system of named gods, each with distinct iconography, temples, and cult centers. It is a reasonable, well-supported theory. It is also, notably, difficult to verify with precision, since the earliest examples of the bare standard survive primarily as small, isolated images on ivory tags, pottery, and ceremonial objects, fragments, not explanations. There is a further complication. Even once the standard becomes firmly established as a grammatical determinative in later, fully developed hieroglyphic writing, its usage is not always as consistent as one might expect from a settled convention. Scribes occasionally employ the sign in contexts where its precise semantic contribution to the word it accompanies is debated among modern translators, cases where the standard seems to signal something beyond a simple "this word relates to a god" category, hinting at a more specific ritual or theological nuance that the sign alone cannot fully convey to a modern reader, working without the accompanying oral tradition that would have clarified its use for an ancient audience. Why would a sign this fundamental, this frequently used across 3 millennia of writing, retain any ambiguity at all? Some linguists specializing in Egyptian grammar suggest the answer lies in the nature of determinatives generally. Unlike phonetic signs, which encode sound, determinatives encode category, and categories are inherently fuzzier, more dependent on cultural context that a modern reader, however skilled, simply does not fully share with the scribes who used them. The god standard, in other words, may be exactly as precise as it ever was. The imprecision belongs to us, the distance of the reader, not to the sign itself. At the more speculative fringes of this discussion, a handful of independent researchers have proposed that the bare, unspecialized form of the standard may preserve traces of a much older pre-dynastic concept of sanctity, one not yet tied to individual gods with names and personalities at all, but to sacred space itself as an independent, almost impersonal category of power, later overlaid by the increasingly personalized pantheon of dynastic Egyptian religion. Mainstream Egyptology remains cautious about this idea, given how little direct evidence survives from the period in question to confirm it, though the theory persists because it offers one possible explanation for why the bare pole appears at all, before any god was ever attached to it. What is certain is only this: one of the most common signs in the entire hieroglyphic system, appearing in temple after temple, papyrus after papyrus, across 3,000 years of continuous use, still carries an origin story that Egyptologists have never fully agreed upon. We can read the sign, we can translate the words it accompanies, but the moment when a simple wooden pole, planted in the ground before some forgotten shrine, first came to mean sacred, and whether it meant something sacred and specific or sacred and undefined, remains just out of reach. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting for a sign whose entire purpose was to point toward the divine without naming it directly. And perhaps the deeper question is this: How much of what the Egyptians considered sacred was never meant to be named at all, only marked quietly with a pole planted in the sand, exactly as this standard once was. Follow the Nile west, away from the temples and tombs, into the dry limestone hills bordering the low desert near Naqada, to a rock outcrop called Gebel Tjauti, positioned along an ancient desert road once used to bypass a difficult bend in the river. Here, on a cliff face largely ignored by travelers for thousands of years, an American archaeological expedition in the 1990s documented a set of rock inscriptions that may represent one of the earliest known attempts to record a narrative in Egyptian writing, and at the center of that narrative sits a sign nobody has been able to confidently explain. The inscription in question dates to the late pre-dynastic period, likely sometime before 3200 BC, making it roughly contemporary with, or possibly even earlier than, some of the material associated with Dynasty 0 rulers found at Abydos. Carved into the rock face is a sequence of images that many Egyptologists interpret as depicting a specific historical or political event. A falcon, associated with royal or divine authority, positioned above a bound captive, alongside additional signs that appear to describe a military or territorial action. If this reading holds, the Gebel Tjauti inscription would represent one of the earliest known attempts anywhere in Egyptian history to record a specific narrative event using proto-hieroglyphic signs, rather than simply marking ownership, identity, or religious dedication, as most other pre-dynastic inscriptions do. Among the signs in this sequence is one that has drawn particular scholarly attention, a symbol whose form doesn't correspond cleanly to any sign in later, fully developed hieroglyphic writing. It is not simply an unusual variant of a known sign, the way some of Esna's invented ram-headed symbols were later built from recognizable elements. This mark appears to be something closer to an independent invention, unique to this specific inscription, its shape-resisting confident classification as an animal, an object, or an abstract symbol. What was it meant to communicate? The mainstream position, cautiously held by several of the archaeologists who first documented the site, treats the sign as a place name or geographic marker, a way of specifying where the depicted event occurred, using a symbol tied to local topography or a regional designation that has since lost all other trace in the historical record. Under this reading, the inscription functions almost like an early proto-historical caption, naming a location and a captor in a manner that anticipates, in miniature, the format later royal inscriptions would use for centuries: a ruler, an enemy, and the place where victory occurred. Yet the case is far from settled. Some specialists in early Egyptian writing have questioned whether we should even be reading this cluster of signs as a coherent sentence at all, in the way we understand sentences from fully developed hieroglyphic texts. The conventions for how signs relate to one another, their order, their grammatical function, even the basic question of reading direction, were still being established during this period. Is the enigmatic sign a place name, as the mainstream reading suggests? Or could it represent a personal name, a specific ruler's identifying mark, akin to the way Iry-Hor's name was rendered through a similarly minimal combination of signs? Without a broader corpus of comparable inscriptions from the same era and the same hand, there is no reliable way to test one interpretation against another. The physical location of the carving adds another layer to the puzzle. Gebel Tjauti sits along a route that appears to have functioned as a desert bypass, avoiding a particularly difficult stretch of the Nile, and inscriptions found along this same road include other early markings, some depicting boats, suggesting the route held genuine strategic and symbolic importance during the period of Egypt's political consolidation. Why record a specific victory or a specific claim at a desert crossing rather than at a major settlement? Was this inscription meant to mark a boundary, warning or informing travelers of whose territory they were entering? Or did the remote semi-public nature of the site serve a different purpose entirely, perhaps intended less for casual travelers and more for a specific informed audience who would have understood exactly what the enigmatic sign meant without any need for further explanation? At the more speculative edges of scholarship on this site, a small number of researchers have proposed that the inscription may document a specific, otherwise unrecorded conflict between rival pre-dynastic polities during Egypt's unification period, a conflict whose participants, causes, and outcome are entirely unknown to us apart from this single, cryptic scene carved into a desert cliff. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as a plausible but unproven possibility, acknowledging that the inscription likely does record something specific and historically real, while remaining honest about how little can currently be reconstructed from a single isolated example. What is not in dispute is the inscription's significance as an early experiment in visual narrative, carved at a moment when Egyptian writing was still deciding how a story, rather than merely a name or a symbol, might be told in stone. The falcon, the bound captive, and the sign beside them have waited in that limestone cliff for roughly 5,000 years, largely unnoticed until modern archaeologists rediscovered the desert road that once led travelers past them. Perhaps the sign was never meant to require translation beyond its own moment, understood instantly by anyone who traveled that road at the time it was carved. Or perhaps it still holds a specific piece of Egypt's earliest political history, waiting in plain sight on a cliff face that history simply forgot to keep explaining. Either way, the question the sign leaves behind is a simple one. What happened here, and why, out of everywhere in Egypt, was it this desert crossing that needed to remember it? A single falcon, carved in profile, stares out from 1,000 fragments of pre-dynastic pottery. Familiar by now, its meaning anchored firmly to Horus and the authority of kingship. But on a small number of surviving objects from the same formative period, that falcon does not stand alone. It appears twice, side by side, mounted together atop a single standard, and no one has ever fully explained why. The double falcon motif appears on a limited but consistent group of artifacts dating to the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, roughly the centuries surrounding 3100 BC, found among the material culture associated with early Nile Valley chiefdoms and the first dynasties that followed. Unlike the single falcon standard, whose connection to Horus and royal legitimacy is well attested across thousands of years of subsequent Egyptian religious and political tradition, the paired version has no clear continuation in later, fully developed Egyptian iconography. It appears for a relatively narrow window of time, on a specific and limited set of objects, and then effectively vanishes from the symbolic record. What did it mean to depict the same divine emblem twice, mounted together rather than simply once? The most straightforward and most commonly proposed explanation treats the double falcon as a symbol of dual authority, potentially representing the union of two previously separate territories or chiefdoms under a single ruler, foreshadowing the dual kingship symbolism that would later become central to Egyptian royal ideology, most famously expressed through the titles Lord of the Two Lands and the eventual union of Upper and Lower Egypt under the double crown. Under this reading, the double falcon standard would be an early, visually direct predecessor to a concept that Egyptian kingship would spend the next 3,000 years expressing through increasingly elaborate and abstract symbolism. This explanation is reasonable, and it fits comfortably within what we know about the broader political trajectory of the period, a landscape of competing regional powers gradually consolidating into fewer, larger kingdoms before final unification. But it does not fully account for every appearance of the symbol. On at least one surviving object, the double falcon appears in a context that some Egyptologists argue does not obviously support a straightforward two territories, one ruler reading. raising the possibility that the symbol carried a more specific or more localized meaning tied to a particular political arrangement, whose precise nature has not survived in any other form. There is also the question of why the motif disappears so completely once Egypt's unification is achieved. If the double falcon genuinely represented the joining of two territories under one authority, one might expect its symbolic role to persist, or at least to echo forward, into the well-documented dual kingship symbolism of later dynastic Egypt. Instead, the paired falcon standard seems to drop out of use entirely, replaced by other more enduring conventions: the sedge and bee, the double crown, the two ladies title, that express a similar concept through entirely different visual language. Why would such an early and visually direct expression of dual authority be abandoned so completely, rather than absorbed into the later symbolic system it appears to anticipate? Some Egyptologists have proposed that the double falcon may not represent territorial union at all, but rather a specific, short-lived political alliance between two rival factions or ruling families. A temporary arrangement, perhaps forged through negotiation or marriage, that dissolved or was superseded before it could establish the kind of lasting symbolic tradition that Egypt's eventual, more permanent unification achieved. Under this reading, the symbol's disappearance is not surprising at all. It would simply reflect the collapse of the specific arrangement it once represented, a political moment significant enough to be carved in stone, yet transient enough to leave no lasting trace beyond these few objects. Complicating matters further, a few of the artifacts bearing this motif come from find contexts that are not fully secure, having been recovered decades ago under excavation standards considerably less rigorous than those used today. This means that even the precise dating and original association of some double falcon objects remains a matter of ongoing scholarly caution rather than settled fact. A reminder that some of Egypt's earliest political history survives to us only through fragments whose original context we can no longer fully verify. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a handful of independent researchers have suggested that the double falcon may reflect an early religious concept distinct from later Horus theology entirely, perhaps representing twin aspects of a single early deity, or two separate falcon cults that briefly merged before one absorbed the other into the singular, dominant Horus tradition that defined dynastic Egyptian religion for the next 3 millennia. Mainstream Egyptology regards this as an intriguing possibility rather than an established conclusion, given how little direct evidence survives to confirm which came first: a political alliance seeking religious expression, or a religious merger later interpreted through a political lens. What remains certain is only this: for a brief window at the very dawn of Egyptian history, someone chose to carve 2 falcons where later tradition would carve 1, or express the same idea through an entirely different symbol altogether. Whatever alliance, arrangement, or belief that doubling once represented did not survive to explain itself to later generations of Egyptians, let alone to us. Perhaps that silence is its own kind of answer, a reminder that not every symbol Egypt produced was built to last 3,000 years. And perhaps the real question is this: how many political unions, religious mergers, or forgotten agreements once seemed important enough to carve in stone, only to be quietly replaced by whatever came next? 2 falcons, mounted side by side, were not the only version of this doubling Egypt's earliest artisans experimented with. On a smaller, more obscure group of objects, a different and more perplexing variant survives. Not 2 separate falcons standing together, but a single carved form that appears to fuse both birds into one composite body, sharing a torso, a base, or in some cases a single set of wings, while retaining 2 distinct heads. This composite sign, sometimes called the Twin-Falcon motif in the limited scholarship devoted to it, appears on a small handful of objects associated with the same late pre-dynastic and early dynastic horizon as its side-by-side counterpart, though it is rarer, more fragmentary, and considerably less studied. Where the paired falcon standard at least offers a visually legible reading, two complete birds, however their meaning is ultimately interpreted, the composite version presents something stranger, a single entity, doubled only partially, as though the artisan intended to express unity and duality simultaneously, within one unbroken form. Egyptologists who have examined these objects generally agree on what they are not. This is not simply a damaged or poorly executed version of the standard double falcon motif, the kind of production error one might expect from an inexperienced carver. The fusion appears deliberate, consistent across the small number of surviving examples, suggesting a specific artistic and symbolic choice rather than an accident of execution. But agreement on what the composite form was deliberately expressing is far harder to come by. One line of interpretation treats the Twin-Falcon composite as a more advanced, more conceptually resolved version of the dual authority symbolism proposed for the separate double falcon standard. Under this reading, the fused form represents not merely two territories under one ruler, but two territories that had, by the time this object was carved, become genuinely unified. No longer two distinct entities standing side by side, but one integrated whole, expressed through a single shared body bearing two heads as a visual memory of its separate origins. If this interpretation holds, the composite sign may represent an important intermediate step in Egypt's political consolidation, a moment when unification had progressed further than the earlier paired standard symbolism could adequately express, but before later dynastic traditions settled on the double crown and other, more abstract conventions to convey the same idea. Other specialists remain considerably more cautious. The fused body, some argue, could just as easily represent something outside the political sphere entirely, a distinct religious concept, perhaps depicting a single divine being conceived from the outset as possessing a doubled or twinned nature, unrelated to any specific territorial claim. Ancient Egyptian religion, across its later, well-documented history, was entirely comfortable with composite and hybrid divine forms, gods merged with other gods, deities depicted with multiple heads, or combined animal and human features to express layered theological concepts. Is the Twin-Falcon composite an early ancestor of that broader tradition of divine fusion, appearing here in one of its very first attested forms? Or does its rarity suggest something closer to a failed experiment, a symbolic attempt that did not resonate widely enough to be repeated, abandoned in favor of simpler, more legible conventions? The physical fragility and rarity of the surviving examples compound the difficulty. Because so few objects bearing this specific composite form have been recovered, and because several come from archaeological contexts documented decades ago under looser excavation standards, researchers lack the kind of broad comparative sample that has allowed more confident interpretation of other pre-dynastic symbols. A single sign, appearing only a handful of times across the entire archaeological record of this period, offers frustratingly little basis for triangulating its intended meaning against other, better documented material. There is also a question of sequence. Did the composite Twin-Falcon form precede the more common side-by-side double falcon standard, representing an initial, more literal attempt at expressing duality that was later simplified into the clearer paired arrangement? Or did it emerge afterward, as a more sophisticated refinement, once the basic concept of dual authority or dual divinity had already been established through the simpler paired form? Without secure, independently verifiable dating for each surviving example, Egyptologists have been unable to resolve this sequence with confidence, leaving open the possibility that our assumptions about which version came first may eventually be reversed by future discoveries. At the more speculative fringes of this narrow field of study, a small number of researchers have proposed that the composite form may reflect a specific, short-lived religious or political experiment unique to one particular community or ruling family, an idea that failed to spread beyond its point of origin and was consequently abandoned within a generation or two, leaving only these few scattered physical traces behind. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as plausible but essentially unprovable, given the extreme scarcity of the material available for study. What is not in question is the deliberateness of the form itself. Someone, working in a period when Egyptian symbolic language was still being actively invented, made the conscious choice to fuse two falcon heads onto a single shared body, rather than simply placing two complete birds beside one another. That choice required more effort, more artistic risk, and more conceptual clarity than the simpler paired version would have demanded. Perhaps this composite sign represents an idea that Egypt considered, tested, and ultimately set aside in favor of simpler symbolism. Or perhaps it captures, in physical form, an intermediate moment of transformation, a fleeting attempt to express something Egyptian religious and political thought would spend the next 3,000 years trying to articulate through other means. Either way, the question the Twin Falcons leave behind is this: what exactly was being joined together here, and why did whoever carved it feel that two heads, sharing one body, said something a single falcon alone never could? That shared body, carved to hold two heads at once, was not the last strange fusion Egypt's earliest artisans left behind. Take the same pole that once held a falcon, or a paired standard, or a composite bird, and on a separate, smaller set of objects, you find something mounted there instead. Not a bird at all, but a serpent, coiled upright around the same kind of staff, rendered with a precision that suggests this, too, was no accident of carving. The Serpent-on-Pole sign appears on a limited number of artifacts from the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, contemporary with much of the falcon standard material already documented from sites across the Nile Valley. Unlike the falcon, whose eventual association with Horus and kingship is thoroughly attested in later Egyptian religion, the early serpent-on-pole motif occupies a stranger position. Serpents do appear extensively throughout later Egyptian iconography, most famously as the uraeus, the rearing cobra affixed to the brow of Egyptian kings and gods as a symbol of protective, often destructive divine power. But the specific configuration found on these early objects, a serpent mounted upright on a freestanding pole or standard, distinct from later crown-based uraeus imagery, does not map cleanly onto that later tradition. Is this early serpent-on-pole sign simply an ancestor of the uraeus, an initial experimental form that later Egyptian religion would refine and relocate, moving the serpent from an independent standard to a fixed position on the royal brow? Several Egyptologists find this plausible, noting that both forms share an underlying association with protective or dangerous divine power, and that Egyptian religious iconography frequently shows this kind of gradual relocation and refinement of symbols across the transition from pre-dynastic to dynastic conventions. Under this reading, the standard itself may have simply become obsolete once the symbolism it carried was successfully integrated into royal regalia directly, rendering an independent serpent standard unnecessary. Yet this explanation, however reasonable, leaves certain details unresolved. On at least one surviving object, the Serpent-on-Pole appears in a grouping alongside other regional standards, in a context some archaeologists interpret similarly to the alliance or procession scenes proposed for other early emblems already documented from this period, suggesting the serpent, like the falcon and the still unidentified Dynasty 0 emblem before it, may have represented not merely an abstract concept of divine danger, but a specific regional cult, chiefdom, or political authority, whose name and territory have not survived in any other form. If that reading holds, we are left, once again, with a symbol standing in for an entire vanished polity, its serpent emblem the only remaining trace of whatever community once carried it. There is also the question of material and craftsmanship. Several of the objects bearing this motif show a level of technical sophistication in rendering the serpent's coils that some specialists argue implies an established, practiced tradition of carving this specific form, rather than a one-off invention. A well-practiced convention, repeated with this kind of consistency, argues against the idea that this was a minor or marginal symbol. Something sustained its production carefully enough, for long enough, to develop real technical refinement. What sustained it, and for how long, before it disappeared from use entirely, remains unclear. Complicating the picture further is the serpent's broader symbolic instability across early Egyptian material generally. Unlike the falcon, whose positive association with kingship and divine authority remains fairly consistent across the pre-dynastic and early dynastic record, serpent imagery from this period appears in more varied and sometimes contradictory contexts, sometimes seemingly protective, sometimes seemingly threatening, sometimes difficult to categorize as either. Does the Serpent-on-Pole sign draw on a specifically protective reading of the serpent, consistent with its later role as royal guardian in the Urias tradition? Or does it draw instead on the serpent's more dangerous adversarial associations, function perhaps as a ward or a warning rather than a marker of royal legitimacy? The objects themselves, stripped of any accompanying text, do not settle the question. At the more speculative edges of scholarship on this motif, a small number of researchers have proposed that the early serpent standard may connect to pre-dynastic religious traditions centered on chthonic or earth-associated deities, distinct from the sky-oriented falcon cults that came to dominate later royal ideology, suggesting a kind of early theological rivalry between sky and earth symbolism that dynastic Egypt eventually resolved in the falcon's favor, leaving the serpent tradition to survive only in a subordinated, protective role. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as an intriguing but largely unproven framework, given how fragmentary the surviving material remains. What is certain is only this: on a small number of objects made by artisans skilled enough to render it with real technical confidence, a serpent was deliberately placed where a falcon might otherwise have stood, occupying the same kind of ceremonial pole, in the same formative period of Egyptian symbolic history, carrying an authority or a warning that the falcon, in the end, would come to represent almost alone. Perhaps the serpent lost a contest of symbols we can no longer fully trace. Or perhaps it never intended to compete with the falcon at all, serving instead some separate, specific purpose that dynastic Egypt eventually stopped needing, once its own royal iconography had fully taken shape. Either way, one is left wondering what exactly this serpent once guarded, warned against, or represented, and why, unlike the falcon beside it, it was allowed to quietly disappear. Centuries before any pole ever held a falcon or a serpent, another symbol had already taken shape, one meant not to stand upright in procession, but to mark a fixed, sacred place. Among the material culture of the Naqada III period, the final and most politically significant phase of pre-dynastic Egypt, spanning roughly 3200 to 3000 BC, archaeologists have identified a recurring architectural symbol carved and painted onto pottery, ivory tags, and ceremonial palettes, a simplified rendering of a shrine or sacred enclosure, distinct in form from the standards and emblems already documented from this same broader era. Unlike the pole-mounted falcon or serpent, this symbol depicts a structure, a small, box-like or niched form, sometimes shown with a curved or vaulted top, generally interpreted as representing an early shrine building, likely constructed of reed, wood, or matting, rather than the stone architecture that would define later Egyptian temples. The shrine form itself is not, on its own, mysterious. Egyptologists have long recognized similar architectural symbols in later, fully developed hieroglyphic writing, where specific shrine types became standardized determinatives associated with particular gods and particular regions of Egypt, the Per-Nu shrine of Lower Egypt and the Per-Wer shrine of Upper Egypt among the most well-documented examples, each tied to specific deities and specific ceremonial functions that persisted in recognizable form for thousands of years. What complicates the picture is a specific variant of this shrine symbol found on a small number of Naqada 3D objects whose interior markings do not correspond cleanly to either of those later well-established forms. On these particular objects, the shrine is rendered with an internal marking, sometimes interpreted as a symbolic representation of whatever sacred object or image the shrine was built to house, sometimes read instead as a kind of identifying label for the specific shrine or cult in question. But the marking itself does not match any symbol securely associated with later, named Egyptian shrine types. It is neither the recognizable form later tied to Horus worship, nor any of the standard emblems associated with well-documented regional cults of the early dynastic period. Whatever this particular shrine housed, or whatever it was called, does not appear to have carried forward into the more standardized religious architecture that followed. Why would a specific, carefully rendered shrine type simply fail to persist into later Egyptian religious tradition when so many of its contemporaries did? One explanation, favored by several Egyptologists studying the political consolidation of this period, treats the unknown shrine as belonging to a specific, localized cult center that lost prominence or was absorbed into a larger, competing religious tradition. Once, Egypt's unification concentrated religious authority around a smaller number of officially recognized temples and deities. Under this reading, the shrine symbol represents a casualty of political and religious centralization, a local sacred site whose specific identity was gradually forgotten once its community's political influence declined, its symbol surviving only by accident, preserved on a handful of objects that happened to escape destruction or reuse. This explanation fits comfortably within the broader historical pattern of the period, during which numerous regional centers across the Nile Valley appear to have lost independent significance as unification concentrated authority around fewer locations. But it leaves an important detail unaddressed. Without a clearer reading of the shrine's internal marking, we cannot say with any confidence what this particular cult actually worshipped, what deity or sacred object the shrine was originally built to house, or what name its community might have used to refer to it. The structure survives, its contents remain unidentified. Some specialists have proposed an alternative reading entirely, suggesting the internal marking may not represent a deity or cult object at all, but rather a specific ritual function associated with the shrine, perhaps indicating its use in funerary practice, agricultural ceremony, or another specific ritual context distinct from the broad divine associations later shrine types would carry. Under this view, the symbol's disappearance would not necessarily reflect the loss of an entire cult, but simply the later standardization of Egyptian religious writing around broader, more generalized shrine categories, absorbing what may have once been a more specific ritual distinction into the simpler determinatives that later scribes preferred. At the more speculative fringes of this narrow area of study, a small number of independent researchers have suggested that the shrine's unidentified marking may preserve the trace of a deity or sacred tradition entirely unattested elsewhere in the Egyptian archaeological record, a local god or sacred object worshipped briefly during Egypt's final formative period before unification, then lost so completely that no later textual reference, however oblique, ever mentions it again. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as a genuine possibility given how much regional religious diversity likely existed before centralization, though it remains, by its very nature, unprovable without further material evidence. What can be said with confidence is only this. On a small number of surviving objects from the final, transformative century of pre-dynastic Egypt, someone carved a specific, deliberate symbol for a shrine that history did not carry forward. Its shape survives. Its name, its god, and its precise ritual purpose do not. Perhaps this shrine represents nothing more than one of many small, local traditions absorbed quietly into Egypt's emerging religious mainstream, its specific identity a casualty of consolidation rather than mystery. Or perhaps it marks the last visible trace of a sacred tradition that once mattered enough to carve in permanent form, only to vanish so completely that nothing else remains to say what exactly was once worshipped there. Either way, the shrine still stands in outline on these fragments, waiting, quietly, for someone to finally identify what it was built to hold. Back at Abydos, the same necropolis where Iry-Hor's name first surfaced from the sand, a different kind of puzzle waits among the tomb inscriptions of Egypt's earliest kings. Not a shrine, not a standard, but a creature, carved repeatedly on ivory labels and ceremonial objects from the first dynasty, rendered with enough consistency to suggest a specific, recognizable animal, and yet matching no species that modern zoologists or Egyptologists have been able to confidently name. The animal in question appears on a handful of small ivory and bone labels excavated from royal tombs at Abydos, particularly those associated with early First Dynasty kings such as Den and his immediate predecessors, in the period following Egypt's unification around 3000 BC. These labels, tiny inscribed tags originally attached to goods and offerings placed in the royal tomb, are among the richest sources of early hieroglyphic writing available to Egyptologists, recording years, events, and royal activities in a compressed visual shorthand. Among the recognizable animals depicted on these labels, cattle, falcons, and other creatures familiar from later Egyptian iconography, one figure stands apart: a quadruped rendered with an elongated body, an unusually shaped head, and, on at least one well-preserved example, a distinctive curved appendage that does not clearly correspond to any horn, tail, or limb configuration found on known Egyptian wildlife of the period. Egyptologists have proposed several candidates over the decades. Some have suggested the figure represents a highly stylized oryx or similar desert antelope, its proportions distorted by the limitations of early artistic convention, rather than by any intent to depict something unfamiliar. Distortion of this kind is not unusual in early Egyptian art, where established conventions for rendering animals in profile were still being standardized, and where artists sometimes combined observed features with symbolic or exaggerated elements to emphasize a creature's significance, rather than its literal appearance. Under this reading, the mystery dissolves into a matter of artistic interpretation. We are looking at a real, known animal, simply rendered in a way that later, more standardized conventions would resolve into clearer, more easily identifiable forms. Other specialists remain unconvinced that stylization alone accounts for every unusual feature of this figure. The proportions in question, some argue, deviate too significantly and too consistently from any known desert or Nile Valley species to be dismissed purely as artistic exaggeration. This has led a smaller number of researchers to propose more specific alternative identifications. One suggestion links the figure to a now extinct or locally extirpated species that may have existed in the Egyptian environment during the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, but disappeared, whether through hunting, climate shift, or habitat loss, before later, more securely documented periods of Egyptian art could record it with any consistency. Faunal remains recovered from pre-dynastic sites do confirm that several animal species present in early Egypt, including certain wild cattle and antelope varieties, did decline or vanish from the region over the following centuries as the climate grew increasingly arid. Could this hieroglyph preserve the last visual record of one such vanished species, captured just before it disappeared from the Nile Valley entirely? This question resists easy resolution, in part because the animal appears so rarely and in such a compressed, symbolic artistic context that comparing it against the broader zooarchaeological record remains extremely difficult. A handful of labels, each only a few centimeters across, offer limited grounds for confidently reconstructing an entire creature's anatomy, let alone confirming its existence as a distinct species rather than an artistic invention or exaggeration. There is also the matter of the label's context. Several of the objects bearing this figure appear alongside inscriptions describing specific royal activities or events, hunting expeditions, offerings, or ceremonial occasions associated with the king's reign. If the animal was genuinely unusual or rare, even by the standards of its own time, its inclusion on these labels might reflect precisely that rarity. A notable, perhaps even prestigious quarry or offering, worth recording specifically because it was uncommon, rather than a routine or symbolic figure meant to represent something more abstract. At the more speculative edges of Egyptological discussion, a small number of independent researchers have proposed that the figure may represent a mythological or composite creature entirely, rather than any real animal, drawing on the broader tendency of early Egyptian religious art to blend observed and imagined elements into single symbolic forms. Mainstream Egyptology treats this possibility cautiously, noting that while composite creatures do appear clearly in later Egyptian mythology, the earliest First Dynasty material generally favors depicting real, identifiable animals over invented hybrids, making a purely mythological reading somewhat less likely, though not impossible, for a figure from this particular period. What remains certain is only this. On a small number of ivory labels, buried alongside some of Egypt's earliest kings, an artist recorded an animal precisely enough to suggest it was real, known and specific to its own time, and yet not precisely enough for anyone, 5,000 years later, to say exactly what it was. Whether the creature vanished from Egypt's landscape, from Egypt's artistic conventions, or simply from our ability to read its remaining traces correctly, is a question the ivory itself does not answer. Perhaps this animal walked the Nile Valley once, ordinary enough to its original audience that no further explanation was ever thought necessary. Or perhaps it was already rare, or already gone, by the time these labels were carved, its true appearance surviving only in this small, imperfect trace. Either way, one is left to wonder what else may have lived, hunted, or been offered in early Egypt that history simply never got the chance to record clearly enough for us to recognize it today. That earlier serpent, standing alone on its pole, was not the only unusual configuration Egypt's early artisans gave to the cobra. On a small, tightly clustered group of objects from the very end of the early dynastic period, the single serpent motif reappears in a far stranger arrangement. Not one cobra, but three, fused together at a shared base, their hoods rendered in unison, forming a single composite hieroglyph that resists easy classification within any known category of Egyptian religious symbolism. The Triple-Cobra composite appears primarily on a handful of seal impressions and ceremonial fragments dating to the transition between the 2nd and 3rd dynasties, roughly the final decades of the 27th century BC, a period already noted by historians for a degree of political and religious instability, including disputed successions and reported religious upheaval under certain kings of the era. Unlike the familiar single uraeus, the rearing cobra symbol thoroughly documented in later Egyptian royal and religious iconography as a protective emblem of divine authority, this triple form shows 3 cobra heads emerging from what appears to be a single shared coil or base, arranged symmetrically rather than simply repeated side by side as separate figures. This distinction matters. A simple repetition of 3 individual cobras standing independently might be interpreted straightforwardly as an intensification of the familiar protective symbolism already well understood from single and even paired uraeus imagery elsewhere in Egyptian art. But the shared base uniting all 3 heads in this particular composite suggests something more deliberate. A single conceptual entity expressed through tripling, rather than 3 separate protective symbols simply placed in proximity. What kind of divine or royal concept required 3 heads to express when one alone had already served Egyptian kingship reliably for centuries by this point? Some Egyptologists studying this narrow body of material propose that the triple form may relate to a specific, short-lived religious innovation associated with the disputed succession of the period, possibly reflecting an attempt by a particular ruler or religious faction to assert an intensified or expanded form of divine protection during a moment of genuine political uncertainty. Under this reading, the tripling would function almost as an emphatic gesture, a visual insistence on divine backing precisely because that backing may have been more urgently and more publicly in question than usual. If legitimacy was contested, multiplying the symbol of divine protection might have offered a way to assert authority more forcefully than convention alone required. Other specialists read the composite differently, suggesting the 3 heads may represent 3 distinct specific protective deities or divine aspects, fused into one symbol to invoke their combined power simultaneously, rather than intensifying a single concept through repetition. Later, Egyptian religious tradition would eventually develop clearly documented triads of gods, worshipped together as coherent groups. Could this composite represent an early, experimental predecessor to that later triadic religious structure, attempting, through visual fusion, what later Egyptian theology would eventually express through more explicit textual and architectural means, dedicated temples housing 3 named gods worshipped as a unified family or group? The scarcity of surviving examples makes testing either theory extremely difficult. Because the Triple-Cobra composite appears on so few objects, concentrated within such a narrow and politically unstable window of Egyptian history, researchers lack the broader comparative material needed to confirm whether this symbol reflects genuine, sustained religious innovation, or a brief, localized experiment tied to one specific ruler or one specific crisis, abandoned once that particular moment passed, and Egyptian kingship stabilized under the more secure dynastic structure that followed. There is also the matter of where these objects were found. Several of the surviving examples come from administrative seal impressions rather than royal tomb goods or temple inscriptions, suggesting the symbol may have carried practical, bureaucratic significance in addition to, or instead of, purely religious meaning, perhaps functioning as a specific administrative or royal authority marker unique to this transitional period, rather than a symbol intended primarily for temple or funerary use. If so, the Triple-Cobra may represent not a theological statement at all, but a mark of specific governmental authority whose precise administrative function simply did not survive into later, more stable dynastic record-keeping. At the more speculative fringes of scholarship on this material, a small number of independent researchers have proposed that the Triple-Cobra composite may encode a specific historical event from this unstable transitional period, perhaps commemorating a resolved conflict between three rival claimants or factions, whose individual identities have not survived in any other historical source. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as an interesting, but essentially unverifiable possibility, given how thin the surviving documentary record for this specific period of Egyptian history remains. What is certain is only this. During one of the most uncertain periods in early Egyptian political history, someone chose to render the cobra, already a well-established symbol of protective divine power, in a form more elaborate and more conceptually demanding than convention required. 3 heads, 1 shared base, appearing only briefly before vanishing from the symbolic record entirely. Perhaps the Triple-Cobra reflects a crisis serious enough to demand an unusually forceful assertion of divine backing. Or perhaps it preserves the trace of a specific religious or political innovation history simply did not have room to fully record before the moment that produced it passed. Either way, the composite leaves behind a quiet, unresolved question. What exactly needed 3 heads to protect it, in a period when even the throne itself seems to have needed protecting? The kings whose contested throne once needed a Triple-Cobra's protection did not rule in symbolic isolation. They governed a calendar, a sky, and a bureaucracy that tracked both. And it is within that same administrative world, barely a generation or 2 later, that a different and equally puzzling sign begins to appear. A crescent shape cradling a circular disc, carved onto ceilings, steely fragments, and a small number of stone vessels from the early Old Kingdom. The Crescent-and-Disc sign shows up most consistently on material dating to the late 3rd and early 4th dynasties, roughly the 27th to 26th centuries BC, a period of rapid architectural and administrative innovation as Egypt moved toward the full pyramid-building tradition associated with kings like Sneferu. On the surface, the sign invites an obvious reading: a crescent moon, cradling a solar or lunar disk, evoking the kind of celestial pairing well attested throughout later Egyptian religious tradition, where sun and moon, day and night, are frequently represented as complementary cosmic forces. Egyptologists broadly agree the sign draws on genuine astronomical observation. Where consensus breaks down is in what, specifically, this particular combination was meant to record. Later, Egyptian hieroglyphic writing does eventually develop clear, standardized lunar and solar symbols, each tied to specific gods, specific calendrical functions, and specific ritual contexts that texts describe in detail. The Crescent-and-Disc sign, however, predates that later standardization, and its particular configuration, the disc nested within, rather than beside, the crescent's arms, does not correspond precisely to any single one of those later, more clearly documented forms. Some Egyptologists read it as an early, unrefined precursor to the developed lunar hieroglyph, its form still fluid before scribal convention fixed it into the version later generations would recognize instantly. Under this view, the sign is less a mystery than a snapshot of a writing system still experimenting with how to capture something as visually complex as a crescent moon appearing to hold the full disk of the sun or moon within its curve, a phenomenon observers would have actually witnessed during certain lunar phases and eclipses. That astronomical possibility is where the puzzle sharpens considerably. A crescent appearing to cradle a disk is not simply an artistic invention. It closely resembles the visual effect of earthshine, when a thin crescent moon faintly illuminates the rest of its own disk, or alternatively evokes the brief visual phases surrounding a solar eclipse, when the sun appears partially obscured by the moon's advancing edge. Did early Egyptian scribes witness and attempt to record a specific celestial event using this sign rather than a generalized cosmic symbol? If so, could the sign's limited window of use, appearing prominently for a relatively short span before fading from later administrative and religious material, reflect the observation of an actual, datable astronomical occurrence rather than an enduring symbolic convention? This question has drawn cautious interest from a small number of researchers working at the intersection of Egyptology and historical astronomy, who note that ancient societies across the world frequently developed unique commemorative symbols following notable celestial events, particularly solar eclipses, which would have carried significant religious weight in a civilization already deeply attentive to solar symbolism and kingship. If the Crescent-and-Disc sign does mark a specific eclipse or lunar event, its brief period of use might correspond to a datable astronomical occurrence within the early Old Kingdom, a tantalizing possibility that would allow historians, for the first time, to anchor a specific piece of undocumented Egyptian history to an external, calculable timeline. Mainstream Egyptology remains appropriately cautious about this reading, since confirming it would require correlating fragmentary archaeological dating with equally uncertain astronomical reconstructions of the period, a match that has not yet been convincingly demonstrated. There is also the administrative context to consider. Several of the objects bearing this sign are sealings, used to mark ownership, authority, or the movement of goods within Egypt's expanding early bureaucratic apparatus. This raises the possibility that the Crescent-and-Disc functioned less as a religious or astronomical marker and more as a specific administrative designation, perhaps identifying a particular office, region, or royal project active only briefly during this period, its celestial appearance simply coincidental to whatever bureaucratic function it actually served. Under this reading, the sign's mystery would lie not in the sky at all, but in the vanished administrative structure it once represented, a structure whose specific role has not survived into any later, better documented Old Kingdom record. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a handful of independent researchers have proposed that the sign may encode a specific religious response to an unusually striking celestial event, one significant enough to briefly reshape local ritual practice before that response faded and Egyptian religion returned to its more familiar sun-centered orientation. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as an appealing but currently unverifiable possibility, in the absence of clearer supporting material from the same narrow window of time. What remains certain is only this. For a brief, specific period near the dawn of Egypt's Old Kingdom, someone carved a crescent holding a disc with enough consistency to suggest real meaning, astronomical, administrative, or otherwise, and then the sign quietly receded from use, absorbed or replaced by the clearer conventions that followed. Whether it once marked a night sky Egyptians actually watched unfold above them, or a bureaucratic function now lost to time, the sign itself offers no further explanation. Perhaps somewhere in the fragmentary record, still buried beneath Old Kingdom sites, a clearer example waits to resolve the question definitively. Or, perhaps, this sign was always meant to describe something as fleeting as the very phenomenon it may depict, gone from the sky and from memory alike, leaving only its brief outline carved in stone to prove it happened at all. Away from the sealed archives and administrative centers of the Nile Valley, out where the cultivated floodplain gives way to open desert, a different kind of record survives, carved not by scribes working within a bureaucracy, but by travelers, expedition parties, and miners passing through some of Egypt's most remote and least hospitable terrain. Among the rock inscriptions scattered across the eastern desert and the routes leading toward the mining regions of Sinai and the Red Sea Hills, one recurring glyph marks what appears to be a specific type of desert shrine, and its precise meaning has proven stubbornly resistant to confident interpretation. The glyph appears at a number of sites associated with Old Kingdom mining and quarrying expeditions, particularly those linked to turquoise and copper extraction in the Sinai Peninsula, alongside routes documented from the 4th through 6th dynasties, roughly the 26th through 22nd centuries BC. These expeditions, well attested through inscriptions left by the officials who led them, required Egyptian workers and administrators to travel far beyond the familiar religious and administrative infrastructure of the Nile Valley, often for extended periods, into terrain that Egyptian cosmology generally associated with danger, chaos, and the domain of foreign or hostile forces. It is precisely in this liminal context that the desert shrine glyph consistently appears, typically carved near natural rock formations, seasonal water sources, or resting points along established expedition routes. The basic form of the glyph is simple enough: a small, roughly rectangular or niched outline, generally interpreted as representing a shrine or votive marker, similar in broad concept to the architectural shrine symbols already documented from earlier periods of Egyptian history. What sets this desert variant apart is a small, consistently repeated internal mark that does not correspond to any known deity symbol securely associated with organized Nile Valley religion of the same period. Whatever this shrine was meant to honor, it does not appear to be one of the major gods whose worship is otherwise thoroughly documented through temple inscriptions, offering texts and royal dedications from the same centuries. This has led most Egyptologists working on Eastern Desert epigraphy to propose that the shrine glyph likely represents a localized, expedition-specific devotional practice, distinct from mainstream Nile Valley temple religion. Under this reading, workers and officials traveling through unfamiliar and genuinely dangerous terrain may have maintained specific protective rituals tied to the desert environment itself, invoking a form of divine protection understood and practiced primarily by those who worked this route regularly, rather than one requiring wider institutional recognition back in the Nile Valley. Similar patterns are documented in later Egyptian history, when desert travelers and miners maintained devotional practices tied to deities like Hathor in her specific role as protector of the Sinai mining regions, suggesting genuine precedent for specialized, occupation-specific religious practice existing somewhat apart from mainstream temple worship. Yet the specific internal marking within this earlier glyph does not clearly correspond to any securely attested early form of Hathor's Sinai iconography either, leaving open the question of whether this particular shrine predates and possibly informed that later, better documented tradition, or whether it represents an entirely separate devotional practice that simply did not survive into the more thoroughly recorded religious conventions of subsequent centuries. Was this an early, still-forming version of what later became organized Hathor worship in the mining regions? Or does it mark a distinct, independent tradition, tied perhaps to a specific expedition leader, a specific mining community, or a danger particular to this exact stretch of desert, one whose protective deity never received the wider institutional recognition that Hathor's cult eventually achieved? Complicating the picture further, the glyph's placement is not entirely consistent from site to site. At some locations it appears prominently, carved with evident care, alongside detailed expedition records naming specific officials and specific royal commissions. At others it appears more crudely rendered, isolated from any accompanying text, suggesting either a different, less formal context of use, or simply a different, less experienced hand doing the carving, perhaps under more difficult or hurried circumstances than the more elaborate examples reflect. At the more speculative edges of Eastern Desert scholarship, a small number of researchers have proposed that the glyph may mark the specific location of a genuine, physical shrine structure, now lost or buried beneath desert sand and rockfall, potentially still awaiting rediscovery at one of the less thoroughly surveyed sites along these ancient routes. Given how vast and how sparsely excavated the Eastern Desert remains compared to the Nile Valley itself, mainstream Egyptologists acknowledge this as a genuine, if currently unconfirmed possibility rather than idle speculation. Unlike many of the symbols already explored in this collection, this mystery carries at least the plausible chance of a future physical resolution, should the right site ever be identified and excavated. What is certain, for now, is only this. For several centuries, Egyptian expedition parties traveling through some of the most inhospitable terrain in their known world carved a consistent symbol marking what was clearly, to them, a meaningful and specific sacred site, one whose god, whose specific protective function, and whose precise place within Egypt's broader religious landscape remain undetermined, despite a documented, repeated pattern of reverence stretching across multiple dynasties. Perhaps this shrine glyph marks an early chapter in a devotional tradition that Egyptian religion would eventually formalize and preserve more completely under later, better-known forms. Or perhaps it preserves something else entirely, a specific desert god known intimately to the miners and travelers who once depended on it, whose name simply never made the journey back to the temples and libraries of the Nile Valley. Somewhere out past the cultivated floodplain, in rock still unexamined by modern survey, that shrine's true identity may yet be waiting to be found. Long before miners carved their desert shrines into the rock of Sinai, an even older symbol had already marked Egyptian authority far to the south, at the very edge of the Nile Valley's reach into Africa, one belonging not to a bird, a serpent, or a shrine, but to an animal Egypt would soon lose entirely from its own landscape. The elephant standard appears on a small number of objects from the late predynastic and very earliest early dynastic periods, roughly contemporary with the falcon and serpent standards already documented from this same formative era, though considerably rarer. Most notably, the symbol has been linked to a specific, semi-legendary, pre-dynastic ruler, sometimes referred to by Egyptologists as the Elephant King, based on evidence from a tomb and associated inscribed material excavated at Hierakonpolis, the same site that produced the Scorpion King's mace head. The elephant, depicted mounted atop a standard in a manner directly comparable to the falcon and serpent versions, appears to have functioned as a regional or personal emblem of authority during Egypt's final push toward political consolidation. Elephants themselves were not, at this early period, wholly foreign to the Nile Valley. Faunal and artistic evidence suggests that elephants inhabited parts of Upper Egypt and Nubia during the pre-dynastic period, before overhunting, habitat pressure, and climatic drying gradually pushed the species southward and out of Egyptian territory entirely within a few centuries of unification. This makes the elephant standard something genuinely unusual among Egypt's early royal emblems. A symbol drawn from a real, locally significant animal that would soon vanish from the very civilization that once used it to represent authority. Why an elephant, specifically? And why does its use as a royal or regional standard seem to fade so quickly once Egypt's more familiar, early dynastic symbolic vocabulary, dominated by the falcon, becomes standardized? One explanation treats the elephant standard as a straightforward casualty of political consolidation, similar to the unidentified emblems and shrine symbols already documented from other pre-dynastic regional centers. Under this reading, the ruler or chiefdom associated with the elephant simply lost out in Egypt's process of unification. Its distinctive animal symbol abandoned once falcon-associated authority, tied to the eventually dominant line of kings, became the accepted standard for legitimate rule. This explanation accounts for the symbol's disappearance from the political record, but it leaves the deeper ecological question only partly addressed. Did the elephant's declining presence in the Egyptian landscape itself contribute to the symbol's abandonment, independent of any political outcome? A royal or regional emblem drawn from a locally visible, locally hunted animal carries different symbolic weight than one drawn from a creature that no longer exists within a community's lived environment. If elephants were already becoming rare or locally extinct in Upper Egypt during the same generations when political unification was underway, The standard's disappearance might reflect ecological reality as much as political defeat, a symbol that simply stopped making practical sense to maintain once the animal itself was no longer part of everyday experience along that stretch of the Nile. There is also the matter of the Elephant King himself, whose precise identity, reign, and relationship to other known pre-dynastic and early dynastic rulers remains genuinely unsettled among specialists. Some Egyptologists tentatively place him among the sequence of rulers at Hierakonpolis contemporary with, or possibly predating, the Scorpion King, suggesting a broader pattern in which this specific site cycled through multiple animal-associated royal emblems during Egypt's final formative century before unification. Others caution against assuming too much continuity or clear sequence between these figures, given how fragmentary and how difficult to date precisely the associated material remains. Was the Elephant King an earlier, failed claimant in the same regional competition that eventually produced the Scorpion King and later Narmer? Or does the elephant standard belong to an entirely separate tradition, geographically or temporally distinct from the other animal emblems already documented from this same site? At the more speculative fringes of scholarship on this material, a small number of researchers have proposed that the elephant standard may preserve evidence of a genuinely distinct pre-dynastic political tradition, one with closer cultural or symbolic ties to Nubian or sub-Saharan African polities to the south than to the falcon-centered tradition that came to dominate dynastic Egypt. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as a plausible avenue worth further investigation rather than an established conclusion, particularly given ongoing scholarly interest in the complex cultural exchanges between early Egypt and Nubia, though the surviving evidence remains too sparse to confirm the extent of any such connection with confidence. What is certain is only this: at the very threshold of Egyptian unification, an animal standard once stood for real, local authority, carried by a ruler whose name and precise history remain only partially reconstructed, representing a creature that would soon disappear from the Egyptian landscape entirely. Whether the symbol's disappearance reflects political defeat, ecological change, or some combination of both remains an open question that the surviving fragments cannot fully resolve. Perhaps the elephant standard represents simply one more regional authority absorbed into Egypt's emerging unified state, its animal emblem retired alongside the political independence it once represented. Or perhaps its fading reflects something quieter and more literal, a symbol that outlived the animal it depicted by only a few generations, carried by a king whose true place in Egypt's earliest history still waits, like the elephants themselves, somewhere just beyond the edge of what the record can confirm. Picture a small stone pallet, no larger than a hand, its surface worn smooth by 5,000 years of desert sand, and at its center, not an animal, not a standard, but a pattern. A tightly wound spiral radiating outward into a symmetrical arrangement of petal-like lobes, carved with a precision that seems almost decorative, almost mathematical, and entirely unlike anything else in Egypt's early symbolic vocabulary. This is the spiral rosette, a rare and visually striking motif found on a small number of pre-dynastic and early dynastic ceremonial objects, most notably on cosmetic palettes, and a handful of ivory and stone fragments dating to the Naqada II and Naqada III periods, roughly the centuries surrounding 3500 to 3100 BC. Unlike the falcon, the serpent, or the elephant, whose symbolic associations at least connect them to real, identifiable creatures with plausible political or religious functions, the spiral rosette depicts nothing recognizably alive at all. It is pure geometric pattern, radially symmetrical, its spiraling arms consistently rendered with a level of care that suggests genuine artistic and possibly technical sophistication rather than casual decoration. spiral motifs are not unique to Egypt during this period. Similar spiral and rosette patterns appear across the broader ancient Near East and the Aegean world during roughly comparable centuries, leading some archaeologists to propose that Egypt's version may reflect a broader, shared decorative tradition circulating through trade contact across the eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium BC. Egypt's pre-dynastic period is well documented as a time of genuine, long-distance exchange, with Mesopotamian artistic influence detectable in a number of other contemporary objects, including certain palette designs and cylinder seal impressions found at Egyptian sites. Under this reading, the spiral rosette would represent an imported decorative convention, absorbed into Egyptian material culture through trade contact, its ultimate origin lying outside Egypt entirely, in the broader visual language of the ancient Near East. This explanation accounts for the pattern's general form and its documented presence in ceramics and small artistic wares across other regions and periods. What it does not fully explain is the very specific, ceremonial context in which Egypt's version of the rosette consistently appears. Unlike simple decorative pottery, the objects bearing this motif in Egypt are overwhelmingly palettes and other clearly ceremonial or symbolically significant items, the kind of object typically reserved for ritual, cosmetic, or funerary use rather than everyday decoration. Why would an imported decorative pattern, if that is indeed its origin, be reserved so consistently for Egypt's most symbolically loaded objects, rather than appearing more broadly across ordinary household goods, as purely decorative motifs typically do? Some Egyptologists have proposed that the rosette, whatever its ultimate origin, acquired a specific symbolic meaning once adopted into Egyptian ceremonial practice, perhaps functioning as a solar or celestial symbol, its radiating arms evoking the sun's rays in a manner conceptually related to, though visually distinct from, the more familiar sun disk imagery that would become standardized in later Egyptian religious art. Under this reading, the imported pattern would represent an early experimental attempt to render solar symbolism through geometric abstraction, an approach ultimately set aside once Egyptian artistic convention settled on the simpler, more easily reproduced disk and rays imagery that dominates later dynastic religious art. Other specialists remain unconvinced that a solar reading fully explains the motif's specific, limited distribution. A smaller number of researchers have suggested the spiral rosette may instead relate to specific funerary symbolism concerning cyclical renewal or rebirth. The spiral's continuous, unbroken line potentially evoking concepts of eternal return that later Egyptian religious tradition would express through very different, more explicitly narrative imagery involving deities like Osiris. Without accompanying text from this early, largely pre-literate period, distinguishing between a solar, funerary, or purely decorative interpretation remains genuinely difficult, since the objects themselves offer no explanatory inscription to settle the question. Complicating matters further, the rosette's appearance in the Egyptian archaeological record is notably brief. The motif seems to fade from ceremonial use relatively quickly as Egypt moves into the early dynastic period, replaced by the more familiar animal standards, royal names, and eventually fully developed hieroglyphic writing that would come to dominate Egyptian symbolic communication for millennia. Why would a motif sophisticated enough to demand real artistic skill, and prominent enough to appear on some of Egypt's most ceremonially significant early objects, simply fall out of use so quickly when other comparably early symbols manage to persist or evolve into later well-documented traditions? At the more speculative edges of scholarship on this material, a small number of independent researchers have proposed that the rosette may reflect a distinct religious or intellectual tradition centered on abstract, non-figurative symbolism, one that Egypt's emerging dynastic culture ultimately moved away from in favor of the more narrative, more figurative visual language that came to define its mature religious art. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as an intriguing but largely unprovable framework, given how limited the surviving comparative material remains from this brief and transitional period. What is certain is only this: for a narrow window near the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, someone carved a pattern of remarkable geometric precision onto objects meant for ceremony rather than ordinary use, then largely abandoned it as Egypt's symbolic language moved toward the figurative traditions that would define it for the next 3,000 years. Whether that spiral once represented the sun, the cycle of rebirth, or an idea entirely foreign to later Egyptian thought remains genuinely unresolved. Perhaps the rosette was simply an early experiment, one aesthetic possibility among several that Egypt's earliest artisans tried and ultimately set aside. Or perhaps, carved into the center of that small stone palette, lies a fragment of a belief system Egypt once held and then quietly let go of, its meaning spiraling inward toward a center we can still see, but no longer fully read. That small stone palette, its surface still holding the outline of a spiral no one can fully explain, belongs to a broader category of pre-dynastic ceremonial objects covered in symbols we only partially understand. Turn that same kind of palette over, or examine others recovered from the same Naqada-era graves, and a different sign recurs with surprising consistency. 3 rounded mounds, evenly spaced, cradling a small circular form nestled just above or between them, carved with a simplicity that belies how little agreement exists about what it actually depicts. Egyptologists refer to this motif informally as the 3 hills with circle sign, and it appears on a modest but consistent group of objects from the Naqada II and Naqada III periods, roughly 3500 to 3100 BC, the same broad window that produced the spiral rosette, and many of the other enigmatic symbols already covered in this exploration. Unlike the rosette, whose geometric abstraction offers no obvious real-world referent, the 3 hills motif appears, at first glance, more straightforward: a landscape. 3 raised forms, evenly arranged, are a natural fit for hills, dunes, or mountains, and the small circle nestled among them invites an equally natural reading as the sun, rising or setting between them. This landscape interpretation finds some support in later, fully developed Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, where a similar 3-peaked sign does eventually become a standardized determinative associated with foreign or mountainous lands, used in words referring to deserts and territories beyond the Nile Valley's cultivated core. If the pre-dynastic version represents an early ancestor of that later sign, the circle nested among the peaks might simply mark a specific, meaningful horizon event. The sun appearing to rise or set at a particular point among specific hills, a moment significant enough to record on ceremonial objects meant to accompany the dead or mark ritual occasions. Yet this reading, plausible as it is, does not account for everything researchers have observed about the sign's actual distribution and context. The specific number of hills, consistently 3 rather than 2, 4, or a more generic cluster, and the specific placement of the circle, which varies somewhat between examples, sitting sometimes directly above the central hill and sometimes nestled in the valley between 2 of the 3, suggests a level of intentional specificity that a purely generic mountainous horizon reading struggles to fully explain. Why 3 hills specifically, repeated with this consistency across multiple separate objects, if the sign was meant only to represent hilly terrain in general rather than a particular recognizable place? Some Egyptologists have proposed that the 3 hills motif may reference an actual, specific geographic location known to the communities producing these objects. Perhaps a distinctive triple-peaked landmark near a particular pre-dynastic settlement, used locally as a marker of orientation, territory, or sacred significance before Egypt's political and religious symbolism became centralized around the conventions that later unified dynastic culture would establish. Under this reading, the sign functions almost like an early place name glyph, encoding a specific local geography that outsiders and later generations gradually lost the ability to identify precisely, even as the general, mountainous land concept survived and evolved into the standardized hieroglyphic determinative of later centuries. Other specialists offer a more calendrical or astronomical reading, suggesting the sign may record a specific solar observation tied to seasonal timekeeping, perhaps marking a solstice or another significant point in the agricultural calendar when the sun was observed rising or setting at a fixed point, relative to a genuine, locally recognized set of 3 hills near the Nile Valley. Pre-dynastic Egyptians, like many early agricultural societies, are known to have tracked seasonal solar patterns to coordinate planting and flooding cycles, making this kind of practical astronomical marking a reasonable possibility, even without direct textual confirmation from a period that left no accompanying written explanation. Complicating both readings is the object type on which the sign most frequently appears: cosmetic palettes, closely associated with personal grooming, ritual preparation, and, in many cases, funerary deposits accompanying the dead. Why would a landscape marker, whether geographic or astronomical, appear specifically and repeatedly on objects tied to funerary and cosmetic ritual, rather than on objects more directly associated with agriculture, land ownership, or calendrical record-keeping? Does the sign's placement suggest instead a symbolic, rather than literal, landscape, perhaps representing a mythological or cosmological horizon relevant to the afterlife, echoing the deep and lasting association between the horizon and rebirth that would become thoroughly documented throughout later Egyptian religious tradition? At the more speculative fringes of scholarship on this motif, a small number of researchers have proposed that the 3 hills may represent an early conceptual ancestor of the Akhet sign, the horizon hieroglyph so central to later Egyptian solar theology, depicting the sun rising between 2 mountains rather than 3. If a genuine developmental link exists between this earlier, 3-peaked version and the later, more standardized 2-peaked Akhet, it would suggest one of the longest continuously evolving symbols in Egyptian religious history. Its exact origin stretching back into a period that left us the image, but almost nothing else, to confirm the connection. What remains certain is only this: on a small, consistent group of pre-dynastic ceremonial objects, someone carved a specific landscape, real or symbolic, with enough deliberate repetition to suggest genuine, shared meaning among the communities who made and used them. Whether that landscape marked an actual place, a specific moment in the solar calendar, or a purely conceptual horizon tied to death and rebirth remains unresolved. Perhaps those 3 hills once stood somewhere along the Nile Valley, recognizable to anyone who lived nearby, their meaning needing no further explanation to an audience who could simply look up and see them. Or perhaps they never existed as physical terrain at all, only as an idea, carved in miniature, marking a horizon that mattered more for what happened there than for where exactly it stood. That question of horizon and symbol, real place or conceptual marker, echoes just as strongly in a far more common Egyptian object, one carried by gods and kings alike for millennia, yet whose earliest form conceals a detail modern Egyptologists still cannot fully explain. The Was-Scepter is among the most recognizable emblems of ancient Egyptian religious and royal iconography. A long, straight staff topped with a distinctive stylized animal head, its base forked into 2 prongs. By the time of the Old Kingdom, its form was thoroughly standardized, appearing constantly in temple reliefs, tomb paintings, and funerary texts as a symbol of power, dominion, and stability, carried by gods, kings, and even personified as a hieroglyph meaning power or dominion in its own right. This later standardized form is not in dispute. What remains genuinely puzzling is a specific variant of the scepter found on a small number of objects from the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, whose topmost element does not match the animal head that would eventually become universal. On these earlier objects, rather than the familiar canine-like head most Egyptologists associate with Seth or a related desert creature, the scepter's top terminates in a form that resists confident classification. Some examples show a rounded, almost bulbous termination lacking any clear animal features at all. Others present an angular, forked shape that some researchers have tentatively read as a stylized bird's head, while others see it as an abstract geometric finial unrelated to any animal form whatsoever. Unlike the mature Was-Scepter, whose animal head is rendered with enough consistency across thousands of later examples to leave little doubt about its intended appearance, these early variants show genuine, unresolved diversity, as though the scepter's most recognizable feature had not yet been fixed into any single, agreed-upon form. This raises a genuinely interesting question about the object's own history. Did the Was-Scepter begin as a more generic staff of authority, its symbolic power residing primarily in its overall shape and its association with stability and dominion, only later acquiring the specific animal head association that would come to define it so completely in dynastic tradition? If so, these early variants would represent a scepter still finding its final form, experimenting with different terminal elements before Egyptian religious convention settled decisively on the canine head now so familiar from later temple art. Under this reading, the mystery is less about a hidden meaning and more about an object mid-transformation, caught on these rare surviving examples at a moment before its iconography had fully crystallized. Other Egyptologists propose a more specific alternative, that these early variants may represent a genuinely distinct object from the later Was-Scepter, related in general form and function, but tied to a different, now lost religious or ceremonial tradition that existed briefly alongside the emerging Was-Scepter tradition before being absorbed or displaced by it. Under this reading, the unusual terminal forms are not incomplete attempts at the familiar canine head at all, but intentional meaningful features of a related yet separate ceremonial staff whose own specific symbolism simply did not survive into the more thoroughly documented dynastic tradition that eventually dominated. Complicating the picture is the scarcity and fragility of the surviving examples. Several of the objects bearing these unusual terminal forms come from tomb contexts excavated decades ago, some prior to the development of more careful modern archaeological recording standards, meaning their precise original condition, and even, in some cases, their precise dating within the broader late pre-dynastic to early dynastic timeframe cannot always be confirmed with full confidence. A damaged or worn terminal, some specialists caution, might account for at least some of the ambiguity researchers have observed, rather than every unusual variant necessarily representing a deliberate, distinct design choice by its original maker. There is also the deeper symbolic question of why this particular object, above so many others in Egypt's early ceremonial repertoire, would eventually achieve such remarkable standardization and longevity, remaining recognizable and consistently rendered for the next 3,000 years, if its earliest forms were genuinely this variable and this unresolved. What process, political, religious, or purely artistic, drove Egyptian convention toward the specific canine-headed form that ultimately prevailed, when these earlier examples suggest multiple competing possibilities were still actively in circulation? At the more speculative edges of scholarship on this material, a small number of independent researchers have proposed that the Was-Scepter's ultimate canine head form may have absorbed and formally replaced several earlier, regionally distinct ceremonial staff traditions, each carrying its own specific terminal symbolism, consolidated into a single standardized emblem as part of the same broader wave of religious and political centralization that reshaped so many other symbols during Egypt's transition into the early dynastic period. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as a reasonable working hypothesis, consistent with patterns already observed elsewhere in this period, though direct confirmation remains elusive given how few of these early variant objects have survived. What is certain is only this: one of Egypt's most enduring and instantly recognizable religious symbols did not begin its history in the fixed, familiar form it would maintain for the following 3 millennia. Somewhere in that transitional period, before the canine head became permanent, other possibilities were carved, considered, and ultimately set aside, leaving only a handful of scepters to hint at a decision Egyptian tradition made and then never explained. Perhaps those earlier terminal forms represent nothing more than an object finding its final shape through ordinary artistic experimentation. Or perhaps they preserve the last visible trace of a separate ceremonial tradition, quietly absorbed into the Was-Scepter's more famous later history, its original meaning carried away by whichever choice Egypt's earliest artisans ultimately made. That forked base, sitting quietly beneath the Was-Scepter's still unsettled head, deserves its own closer look, because a fork of a different kind, appearing independently on a separate class of pre-dynastic and early dynastic objects, has generated a puzzle entirely its own. Egyptologists refer to this recurring sign informally as the forked staff hieroglyph. A simple vertical line splitting near its base or top into 2 distinct prongs, appearing on a modest number of ivory labels, pottery marks, and ceremonial fragments dating broadly to the same late pre-dynastic through early dynastic horizon already covered extensively in this exploration, roughly 3200 to 2900 BC. Unlike the Was-Scepter, whose forked base sits beneath a clearly intentional, if variable, animal-associated head, the forked staff sign in question typically appears in isolation, without any accompanying figural element, as a standalone mark whose meaning must be inferred entirely from its shape and its context of use. The most straightforward reading, favored by a number of Egyptologists studying early administrative marks from this period, treats the forked staff as a numerical or accounting notation, similar in general function to other early tally marks and quantity indicators known from pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egypt, which frequently used simple abstract shapes to record counts of goods, livestock, or land measurements before more developed numerical hieroglyphs became standardized. Under this reading, the fork itself carries no symbolic weight beyond its practical function as a specific, recognizable mark within an early bookkeeping system, its precise numerical or categorical meaning simply lost to us because so little comparative administrative material survives from this exact period. This explanation is reasonable and consistent with what is generally understood about early Egyptian administrative practice. It does not, however, comfortably account for every context in which the sign appears. On a smaller subset of objects, the forked staff shows up not on clearly administrative material, but on items with more evident ceremonial or funerary association, positioned in ways that some specialists argue suggest a symbolic rather than purely quantitative function. If the sign genuinely served 2 such different purposes, simultaneously functioning as both an accounting mark and a ceremonial symbol, was this deliberate layering of meaning, similar to the kind of multivalent symbolism later observed in the invented signs at Esna covered earlier in this collection? Or does the sign's appearance across such different contexts simply indicate 2 entirely separate, coincidentally similar marks that modern scholars have mistakenly grouped together as a single motif for lack of a clearer framework distinguishing them. Some researchers have proposed a specific alternative reading tied to land or water management, suggesting the fork may represent an early symbol for the division or measurement of agricultural plots, or possibly canal or irrigation branch points, given ancient Egypt's well-documented reliance on organized water management, even in this earliest formative period of state administration. Under this view, the forked staff would function almost like an early cartographic or surveying mark, recording a specific type of boundary or division relevant to land administration, a practical, bureaucratic tool whose specific technical meaning simply did not carry forward into the more standardized hieroglyphic writing system that followed. Complicating any single interpretation further is the sign's apparent variability in exact proportion and angle across different surviving examples. Some show a narrow, tight fork close to symmetrical. Others show a much wider, more asymmetrical division between the two prongs, a level of formal inconsistency that would be unusual for precisely standardized administrative or numerical convention, yet also difficult to explain confidently as intentional, meaningful variation without more comparative material to test the pattern against. There is also a chronological puzzle worth noting. The forked staff sign appears to fade from use at roughly the same broad transitional period when several of the other emblems and symbols already documented in this exploration, the double falcon, the Triple-Cobra, and various regional standards likewise disappear from Egypt's evolving symbolic vocabulary. Does this shared timing reflect a genuine, connected process, an era of rapid administrative and religious standardization that swept away numerous earlier, more experimental or regionally specific signs all at once as centralized dynastic convention took hold? Or is this apparent clustering simply an artifact of how sparse and unevenly preserved the archaeological record from this narrow window happens to be, making unrelated symbols appear to vanish together, purely by coincidence of survival, rather than genuine historical connection? At the more speculative fringes of scholarship on this particular sign, a small number of independent researchers have suggested the forked staff may relate to an early, since-abandoned system of regional or dynastic identification, functioning similarly to the standards and emblems already explored, marking a specific administrative district or authority whose name and territory did not survive into later, better documented Egyptian provincial organization. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as plausible in general outline, but difficult to confirm given the sign's scarcity and its inconsistent context of use. What remains certain is only this: a simple, forked mark, appearing across administrative, ceremonial, and possibly land management contexts throughout Egypt's final formative century before full dynastic standardization, resists confident placement into any single explanatory category. It may have meant several different things depending on where and how it was used, or it may represent a single, coherent concept whose specific meaning simply required no further explanation to the people who carved it. Perhaps the fork marked something as mundane as a tally of goods, its meaning obvious to any contemporary reader, and therefore never thought to require elaboration. Or perhaps it once carried a more specific administrative or symbolic weight that Egypt's rapidly standardizing bureaucracy eventually replaced with clearer, more universal conventions, leaving this small divided mark behind as one of the quieter casualties of Egypt's long march toward a fully unified system of writing. Follow the Nile back toward its marshy fringes, where reeds and open water once dominated the landscape, before agriculture reshaped the valley floor, and where fishing and hunting communities of the pre-dynastic period left behind one of Egypt's most functional early tools, carved in a form that would eventually become permanent hieroglyphic writing: the harpoon. On a small, distinctive group of objects, however, this familiar sign appears in a decorated variant, whose added details have never been fully explained. The standard Harpoon hieroglyph, well documented across Egyptian writing from the early dynastic period onward, depicts a barbed fishing or hunting implement, its form directly derived from real tools used throughout the pre-dynastic period for hunting hippopotamus, crocodile, and large Nile fish. Activities thoroughly attested through both archaeological remains and early artistic depictions. The sign's later standardized use as a phonetic and symbolic element in Egyptian writing, including its association with specific verbs related to spearing and hunting, is not in question. What draws sustained scholarly attention is a specific subset of harpoon depictions from the late pre-dynastic period, found primarily on ivory and bone objects from sites including Hierakonpolis and Abydos, where the harpoon shaft bears small, deliberately carved decorative marks unrelated to the tool's practical function. These marks vary somewhat between examples, but generally take the form of small parallel lines, cross-hatching, or occasionally a repeated dot pattern running along the harpoon's shaft, positioned in a manner too consistent and too deliberate to be dismissed as incidental wear or accidental carving marks. A functional harpoon, whether real or depicted, requires no such decoration. The marks add nothing to the tool's practical effectiveness as a hunting implement. Their presence, confined specifically to certain ceremonial and ivory-carved examples rather than appearing on cruder, more utilitarian depictions, suggests they carried meaning beyond simple artistic embellishment. One widely considered explanation treats these decorative marks as an early form of ownership or achievement marking, similar in concept to tally systems documented elsewhere in pre-dynastic material culture, potentially recording a specific hunter's individual kills, a particular hunting expedition's results, or perhaps a specific status achieved through successful hippopotamus or crocodile hunting, activities that carried genuine prestige and likely religious significance in pre-dynastic Egyptian society, given the dangerous and symbolically potent nature of these animals in later Egyptian religious tradition. Under this reading, the decorated harpoon would function almost as a personal or commemorative record, its marks meaningful primarily to the specific hunter or community that produced it, rather than representing a broader, standardized symbolic convention intended for wider recognition. This explanation fits comfortably within what is generally understood about the social and religious importance of hunting during this period, but it remains difficult to confirm precisely, since the marks show enough variation across different objects that no clear, repeatable counting or recording system has been definitively established. Do the varying numbers of lines or hatching marks correspond to specific, countable achievements, as the tally reading suggests? Or does the variation instead reflect something more individualized, an artisan's personal or symbolic choices that do not reduce to a simple quantitative system at all? A separate line of interpretation proposes that the decorative marks may relate specifically to ritual or religious preparation of the harpoon itself, rather than to the hunter's personal record. Under this reading, the marks could represent a form of consecration or ritual empowerment applied to a weapon intended for use against dangerous, symbolically potent creatures, a practice that would find later better documented parallels in Egyptian religious tradition, where ritual objects and weapons associated with the king's authority over chaos and dangerous forces were frequently imbued with protective or empowering symbolism through specific decorative and inscriptional conventions. Complicating both readings is the object's consistent ceremonial or funerary context. Nearly all surviving examples of the decorated harpoon variant come from tomb deposits, or clearly ceremonial ivory carvings rather than from ordinary settlement debris, suggesting that whatever these marks recorded or achieved, their significance was considered important enough to accompany their owner into the afterlife, or to be preserved as part of a broader ceremonial assemblage rather than discarded after ordinary use. At the more speculative edges of scholarship on this narrow category of object, a small number of researchers have proposed that the decorative marks may encode a specific numerical or calendrical system tied to hunting seasons or ritual timing, potentially recording when, rather than simply how many times, a successful hunt occurred, information that could carry significant religious weight if tied to specific astronomical or agricultural cycles already known to have mattered deeply to pre-dynastic Egyptian communities. Mainstream Egyptology regards this as an intriguing but currently unverifiable possibility, given how few securely dated and well-preserved examples exist for comparison. What is certain is only this. On a small number of carefully preserved ivory and bone objects from Egypt's final pre-dynastic centuries, someone took a functional hunting tool and deliberately transformed its depiction into something more than practical, adding marks that carried meaning without carrying function. Whether those marks recorded a specific hunter's achievement, a ritual act of empowerment, or a calendrical moment now lost to us, they were considered significant enough to preserve permanently in some of the most carefully worked objects this period produced. Perhaps those small carved lines once told a story every viewer immediately understood: a hunter's name, a specific triumph, a particular season, requiring no further explanation to an audience who lived alongside the marshes and knew exactly what such marks meant. Or perhaps they preserve a private, personal system of meaning that never extended beyond the individual who carved it, its exact significance buried with its owner and never intended to survive for us to decode at all. Reeds, dense and rustling along the marsh edge, gave the pre-dynastic Nile much of its raw material, for boats, for shelter, and, carved permanently into ivory and stone, for one of Egypt's most enduring hieroglyphic signs. Long before it became the standardized phonetic reed leaf sign of later Egyptian writing, this plant appears in an earlier, bundled form, whose exact significance remains only partly understood. The mature reed leaf hieroglyph, well attested from the Old Kingdom onward, is simple. A single, upright reed, rendered as a phonetic sign used extensively throughout Egyptian writing. But on a small number of late pre-dynastic and early dynastic objects, primarily ivory labels and ceremonial fragments from Abydos and Hierakonpolis, an earlier variant appears instead. Not a single reed, but a tightly bound bundle of several stalks, tied at a consistent point along their length, rendered with enough care to suggest the bundling itself carried meaning beyond simple botanical depiction. Reed bundles held genuine practical importance in pre-dynastic Egypt, used in construction, boat building, and shrine architecture. A connection some Egyptologists have already noted in relation to the early shrine symbols documented elsewhere in this collection, whose box-like forms likely represented actual reed and matting structures. Under one reading, the bundled reed sign simply depicts this practical material directly, perhaps marking construction materials, shrine components, or building projects recorded on administrative labels. Its later evolution into a single, standardized reed sign reflecting nothing more than the gradual simplification typical of early hieroglyphic development. Yet the consistency of the bundle's specific tie point and the recurring number of stalks depicted has led other researchers to propose something more deliberate, that the bundle may represent a specific quantity or measure, an early unit of accounting tied to reed harvesting or construction material distribution, its exact numerical meaning lost along with the broader administrative context that would have made it legible to contemporaries. Without accompanying text to confirm either reading, the bundled reed remains suspended between the mundane and the symbolic, much like several of the other early signs already explored. At the more speculative edges of scholarship, A handful of researchers have suggested the bundle may carry an early symbolic association with unity or collective strength, a single, unmistakably rendered idea, foreshadowing themes of gathering and binding that would recur throughout later Egyptian political and religious symbolism. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as plausible but unconfirmed, given how sparse the surviving examples remain. What is certain is only this: a bundle of reeds, carved with evident care onto a handful of objects from Egypt's formative centuries, once meant something specific enough to warrant repetition, before Egyptian writing simplified it into the single reed sign that would serve the language for the next 3,000 years. Whether that meaning was material, numerical, or symbolic, the bundle itself has kept it secret. Perhaps it recorded nothing more than an ordinary shipment of building material, unremarkable to anyone at the time. Or perhaps, tied together at that same careful point on every surviving example, it once held a meaning as binding as the reeds themselves, waiting still to be untied.